El doctor Charles Wolfe es un investigador del Departamento de Filosofía y Ciencias Morales del Centro Sarton de Historia y Ciencia de la Universidad de Ghent. Se ha dedicado a la docencia, inclusive como profesor invitado. Tiene numerosas publicaciones en el marco de materialismo, viejos y nuevos materialismos. Ha editado los volúmenes de Monsters and Philosophy, es coeditor del texto The Body as Object, an Instrument of Knowledge, Embodied Empiricism in Early Modern Sciences, es coeditor de Vitalism and the Scientific Image in Post-Enlightenment Life Sciences, es editor de Brain Theory, Essays in Critical Neurophilosophy y de numerosos otros textos y artículos siempre relacionados a la temática. Es para nosotros un honor tenerlo con nosotros a través de Skype. So, we are ready to listen to your conference on old and new materialisms.
Thank you for the introduction. What can I say? Sorry not to be there physically, so it makes me a bit more boring as a speaker. I'm not standing, I can't gesticulate and look at you in the face. I'm sitting at a desk in an ugly office. But happy to be with you in some sense. So I work primarily on the old materialism or the old-fashioned materialism, but I've been engaged for, 10, 15 years in some kind of project of rethinking, reevaluating, revising the history of materialism, and with a special focus, a sort of specific focus on materialism in life, materialism in the body, materialism in the sciences. And in that sense, I was already engaged in fighting some historiographic and maybe theoretical battles about materialism before the more recent theoretical episode of new materialism, which, if one treats new materialism strictly as some kind of historiographic reading or appropriation of the older one, of course, one is either missing the point or one can make some very boring criticisms. So I hope that today I don't only make something like, boring criticisms. So now and then I say the word slide, and Carolina, you'll show the slide?
Yeah, sure.
Good. So slide. Let's see. I want to sort of see what you see. Yeah. The problem of new and old materialism is that, the problem that I find significant in the opposition between new and old materialism is this opposition between passive and active, static and dynamic, etc. So that the new materialism presents itself as creating or giving birth to or reconstructing a more dynamic picture, and then the old materialism is often presented as trapped in a sort of passive, static, blueprint world, cartographic world. And there's a sense in which that's exactly the opposition I've always been interested in dealing with early modern and Enlightenment materialism. And in the kind introduction that you were just given for me, I think I can add that I put out a few months ago a short book called Materialism, a Historical Philosophical Introduction. And there, and in some other papers, I've been looking at the interplay between vitalism and materialism. The fact that early modern vitalism is not so hostile to materialism as we often think. It's going to make me dizzy.
Sorry.
It's okay. and the fact that early modern materialism is not such a stranger to the problem of life and the nature of life as we might think. And a point that I will be making today is that the concept of passive mechanistic materialism, a term I will come back to in a few minutes, that the concept of mechanistic materialism really breaks down. It's a construct of its enemies. It's invented mainly to criticize someone. And there is a very rich history and kind of ideological Begriffsgeschichte that one could tell of the concept of mechanistic materialism as it moves through early Christian, I mean, not early the church fathers, but early modern Christian anti-materialism, to Marxism-Leninism, to humanism, and on to certain moments in embodied phenomenology and in activist cognitive science. So someday, if I have either the time or the energy, I might write a kind of ideological study or study of ideological shifts in the concept of mechanistic materialism. Today I will just be mentioning it. And indeed, the distinction between passive and active forms of materialism is not strictly a chronological or diachromic distinction, because those forms of materialism exist very clearly synchronically. So in that sense, and here I object to some of the rhetoric that you can find in, I think, for example, in Jane Bennett, but it's actually relatively old-fashioned, sort of 1970s, 80s hermeneutics of suspicion rhetoric. So I object to the idea that we needed Marx, Nietzsche, or Freud, or phenomenology for materialism to be able to include a real tension between inert, dead, static, passive matter and a more active matter. And slide. Here's an example of in Toland in the early years of the 18th century, and in Diderot in the 1740s, 50s, 60s, you have a lot of articulation of active properties as essential properties of matter. Then the question can be, what active properties? Is it just motion? Is it life? Is it thought? Is it, as Diderot is obsessed with, is it sensibility or sensitivity? So in French, sensibilité. And I guess one could give a sort of counterfactual, one could imagine counterfactually quite easily, new materialist reflections on a good vision of active matter. And if one wants to play with early modern authors, Francis Glisson, Lady Margaret Cavendish, Diderot could be part of that story, versus a bad vision of mechanistically specified passive matter, for example, in Hobbes or in D'Holbach. The problem with that opposition, which is reminiscent of works, I don't know if this is a familiar title or not to you, Carolyn Merchant's, excuse me, Carolyn Merchant's Death of Nature, a book from about 1979, I think. That kind of opposition of the good, rich, active versus the bad, passive, yields a kind of neo-paganism, which is an odd point of arrival for materialism. But it would be a point of arrival welcomed by, slide, those like Jane Bennett, for whom the new materialist ontology focuses on, quote, the vibrant, constitutive, aleatory, and even immaterial indices that characterize the new senses of materiality and materialization. I mean, that's very enthusiastic language, right? So these kinds of calls for a new materialism, which would do justice to the reality of embodiment, to the historicity of the body, maybe to a degree of agency implied in self-construction, a kind of cyborg materialism, as it were, to borrow a famous phrase, Haraway. These kinds of invocations of a possible new materialism make sense if we juxtapose them to the construct of excuse me, if we juxtapose them to the construct of mechanistic materialism, so next slide, in the classic sense, like Descartes understanding the body. So, Treatise on Man is not the title of Descartes' work in the original Traité de l'Homme. If we understand the body like a machine made of earth, and you all know the famous set of metaphors in early modern mechanism, so pulleys, funnels, sieves, the different, clockwork machine metaphors for body. New materialist calls to attend to materiality, experience, and self-construction seem convincing when they are contrasted with this Cimmerian vision of an early modern context in which, as Jonathan Sade put it, that's still in the slide, as a machine, the body became objectified, a focus of intense curiosity, but entirely divorced from the world of the speaking and thinking subject. And that's from a very beautiful study of early modern anatomy in Valius by Sade. But in that sense, Sade is still recycling oppositions that I don't think the scholar, or in a sense the philosopher, needs to still be perpetuating. And I think those oppositions are present in some of the new materialist literature. That's a side comment. Now, I just said that calls for new materialism make sense when they're juxtaposed to that classic, almost stereotypical mechanistic picture. But, if we examine the reality of early modern materialism a bit more closely, the mechanistic materialism concept falls apart, as does the pertinence of a sort of new versus old distinction. For example, slide. For example, the claim that new materialist ontologies are abandoning the terminology of matter as an inert substance subject to predictable causal forces. Now, a case in point for the concept of mechanistic materialism is the following statement by Engels, Friedrich Engels, well known to historians of materialism, maybe not as well known in the new materialist circle, and they might discover an unknown ancestor at that point. So, slide. I won't read all this passage by Engels, which you have there in Spanish. It's an interesting passage. It was quite influential. One can debate the extent to which Marx himself fully held this view. I'm not really qualified to debate that, but what do I want to say about this? Notice the opposition between the past century materialism, so he means the 18th century, predominantly mechanistic. Man was understood just as a machine, and he's basically saying the new chemistry, the new organic chemistry, the new sciences of life. So he's writing in that sense mid-19th century. Leave far behind this crude mechanistic picture. Now, I don't mean to just be sarcastic or insolent, but there's a sense in which Engels is the first new materialist. Put differently, that his mixture of normative language and historical claims closely prefigures the supposedly new materialist moment. Not in the best way, because it's a very problematic set of claims that he's making. There are two problems here: the mechanistic materialism concept and the content of the new versus old distinction. Now, let me be clear. I really don't think that anything prevents the contemporary theorists of materiality, selfhood, the body, from calling their position new materialism. But then, and this is the tricky part for me, it's not methodologically completely transparent to me. Then we have this historiographic and indeed philosophical problem, which I will be, returning to, like, to use a very idiomatic English expression, like a dog worrying a bone, sort of returning endlessly to the bone. Why does mechanistic materialism as a concept fall apart, including historically? At least three aspects should be distinguished. Slide. First of all, writers who use this notion, and by this I don't just mean Engels, I mean people writing 3 years ago also. Writers using the notion seem to curiously neglect the major metaphysical gap between mechanism, as represented by, in different ways, by Descartes, Galileo, Boyle, the gap between those projects and materialism. It is disconcerting to read new materialists equating Cartesian and Newtonian concepts of matter, sometimes speaking, this is Kuhl and Frost, introduction to their volume, the Cartesian-Newtonian understanding of matter as domination of nature, etc., etc. That's, by the way, but this is just a parenthesis, that's not a project Newton would endorse. But philosophically speaking, the majority of early modern mechanists were either substance dualists or agnostic concerning the nature of any foundational substance like matter. This seems rather well known and unproblematic, so I won't dwell on it further except in discussion, of course, happy to talk about it. So first, there is just this glaring metaphysical gap between mechanism and materialism. Second, those who use the concept of mechanistic materialism neglect, are blind to, but that's a bit strong, let's say neglect, the presence of a strong concern with embodiment. That's a word that's important to me, and I guess important to the rest of these writers too, so let me say it loudly. Embodiment. A difficult word to translate because I assume Spanish is like French in this regard. The obvious translation is incarnation, I guess incarnación in Spanish, which is of course the Christian word, so there's plenty of problems there. But anyway, people using the mechanistic materialism concept neglect the presence of a very strong concern with embodiment in various early modern materialists, as I've written about a few times, including in a few chapters of that little book I mentioned. This neglect includes the common tendency to take works such as La Maîtrise de l'Homme-Machine, L'Homme-Machine, that's a classic work of materialism. The common tendency to take works like that literally, to take the title literally, because despite the provocative title of his book, La Maîtrise never reduces the properties of the living body to the properties of inanimate matter or those of machines. And of course, that opens up a lot of other questions. Which machines? And the fascination with automata in the Enlightenment is in a large part a fascination with life, by the way. And Jessica Riskin has written nicely about this, among other people. So, l'homme-machine never reduces the organic to the inorganic. It is, indeed, to be sure, it is a bold piece of reductionist argumentation, but as I discussed below in the final part of my talk, the reduction that La Maîtrise proposes is a soul-to-body reduction. I also note linguistically that the word machine in French of the period could often refer to the body. That's a little bonus linguistic. I won't take time here to discuss the third of Engels' mistaken claims, the claim about chemistry emerging in the 19th century. There has been some very nice work in the last few years on the chemical obsession in 18th century matter theory and materialism. Those of you who read French can read a very nice book by François Pépin on that topic. So, we should distinguish between materialisms based on passive matter and materialisms based on active matter, where the latter focus on activity includes notions of dynamism, self-transformation, plasticity, and so on. And this latter set of properties is exactly what the new materialists claim, is exactly what the new materialists claim to be new. New, of course, for them is still an elastic category, so Bergson or Whitehead can be considered part of the new, whereas Anthony Collins, Diderot, or Joseph Priestley might not be new. I already said earlier that this distinction between passive and active forms of materialism is not strictly a chronological distinction. For example, that was a, I can see the corner of that slide, and that's good, with the Cudworth quote. I was going to say, one could, and I've started to in other work, look at the hostility to passive matter in Cambridge Platonism, so for example, in Cudworth. And you can see in Cudworth and Henry Moore, certain related authors, this, to me, almost strange level anger directed at this world of passive matter. So, one problem in opposing new materialism and old materialism is that there was a very developed embodied materialism, or concern with embodiment, in early modern and Enlightenment materialism. Now, I don't just want to say, or I don't really want to say, oh look, new materialism is great, but it already existed 350 years earlier. That's not exactly what I want to say. For one thing, the kinds of vital materialists that I'm interested in early modern and Enlightenment times, I don't think that they would agree, I'm speaking a bit plainly also for the hope of communication, I don't think they would agree with statements like, slide, the Merleau-Ponty claim that the mind does not use the body, but fulfills itself through it, while at the same time transferring the body outside of physical space. So that's a form of dualism, which traces back to the well-known and well-studied Husserlian distinction between Körper, body in the sense of one body among others in a kind of giant mechanistic world, Körper und Leib. So Leib in German is flesh, in the sense of a subjectivity, which is the locus of experience. This is a very powerful, intuitive distinction. Aristotle famously talks about how the hand is no longer a hand if it's cut off from my body. So you might say the hand by itself is a body, just like this is a body, just like this is a body, whereas flesh has these additional properties, including the fact that it's always my own. The early modern, let's say, embodied materialist, I said that she would not agree with the Merleau-Pontian distinction, number one. Number two, she would not confuse materialism with inactivist phenomenology, as we find sometimes in new materialism. If we consider inactivist parti pris, platform statements in the same slide, so simply looking down, in the same slide, sorry. I'm just saying, if you go down from the Merleau-Ponty, you have a statement by an influential, maybe the influential theorist of inactivism, Evan Thompson. I read it because it's important for my story, negatively important. Life is not physical in the standard materialist sense of purely external structure and function. Life realizes a kind of interiority, the interiority of selfhood and sense-making. We accordingly need an expanded notion of the physical to account for the organism or living being. By the way, speaking in my own sort of professional biography, so to speak, I've been very interested in the history and theory of the concept of organism. It's not something that I find negligible or to be dismissed. It's the way philosophically one might argue for it that poses problems. My simple response, and I will come back to this, but my simple response to Evan Thompson's claim is that this quote-unquote expanded notion of the physical has always been present It's rather his impoverished picture of standard materialism, which I hope you can see. What does it sound like? It sounds like Engels. That picture of standard materialism needs to be revised. From the early anti-materialist portrayals of a kind of necropolis, a dead, cold, mechanically specified matter to which humanity, value, feeling, freedom is reduced. From those early anti-materialist claims to the more historicized claims of Engels, or the more theoretically determined opposition of old and new in new materialism, I hope to have made clear, at least for now, that this picture of affairs, this picture of the state of things, misses some features of early modern materialism. Slide. It misses, well, it misses minimally, or perhaps one can reduce the problem to 3 points. Historically, the projection of a dead materialism concept misses the vital character of radical Enlightenment materialism, also the influence of chemistry, etc. Ethically, it misses the specifically affective, that is to say, flesh and blood, determinism of la maîtrise, the more organismic vision of Diderot, with its intimations of sympathy and thus intersubjectivity. So again, the affective point is that we are dealing with materialism and we are dealing with hostility to free will and other such doctrines, except that it's a hostility to free will not in the name of pure mechanism, but of something like flesh and blood creatures. It's something that at least I've been interested in elsewhere. So historically and ethically, we have those problems, and metaphysically, and I don't develop this much here, the new materialist discourse seems to miss the dimension of what we might call an ontology of relations, which most famously, strongly is articulated in Spinoza, but is quite present in some Enlightenment authors. And in that sense, one shouldn't operate with an easy opposition between a world of subjectivity and personhood and a world of mere causal relations. And I realize that in recent years, some of the debates on biology, feminism and biology in the new materialist context, have completely challenged those oppositions. And I want to get to that in my final remarks. But nevertheless, those are very powerful and enduring oppositions. And I think, how could I put it? Whether Jonathan Sade or Engels or Evan Thompson or many others, they might be surprised to find what one can do with a concept of individuality articulated in an ontology of relations. And again, for those of you who read French, I have there in the list of names Yves Citon. Yves Citon has a beautiful, very rich, somewhat challenging and very complex book, but very rich book called L'Envers des Lumières, which develops that notion very well. So now I make a kind of caveat. Now I soften this sort of absolute me and them or true and false rhetoric. Because if the objections that Engels and the new materialists made were not immune to a closer examination of the texts or the historical record, if this does not mean that all features of new materialism are just there in the early modern period. So take subjectivity. To me, it's very convenient to point to the crudeness with which some older commentators opposed the merely external, spatial, and implicitly mechanistic world of the materialist to an internal, temporal world of mind and freedom. And one of the oddest places I have found that language is in a piece of Diderot scholarship, so slide. Next slide. Thanks. This is an article from 1968 on materialism and monsters in Diderot. It appears in a journal dealing with Diderot in the 18th century. It's a piece of scholarship. So it's extra surprising to find such aggressive normative language. And let me read it a bit. Materialism as a working philosophy used as a tool in the scientific investigation of the material universe is appropriate and highly effective. So in this funny way, it's a sort of philosophie spontanée des savants, right? It's materialism as a sort of facilitator of what science does is okay. However, we might add to her sentence, however, intended for the objective analysis and description of the world of externals. It's a great phrase, right? The world of externals. To make a really, really horrible recent American politics joke, the word externals sounds a bit like the deplorables, but where am I? The appropriate to the world of externals, it yields disastrous results when applied to the inner subjective world of human nature, human thought, human emotions. There's a lot one could say about where does she get that opposition from? How do we know it's true? What work does it do? What is this inner versus outer distinction? But notice that even if this is a bit crude, it's very similar to the passage by Evan Thompson that I cited before. We don't need to worry about jumping between slides right now, but I read the Evan Thompson sentence again. Life is not physical in the standard materialist sense of external structure and function. Life realizes a kind of interiority, the interiority of selfhood and sense-making, et cetera, et cetera. So let me reprise this paragraph, because I started to say something like, don't think that I'm claiming that all of the exciting part of new materialism was already there. So you should all go home and the theory wasn't helpful. That's not what I want to be saying. Because if we consider the more crude version in the Amy Hill 1968, or the more sophisticated version in Evan Thompson 2007, if we turn to recent, well, let's call it feminist discourse on materiality, we find discourse, we find language, we find concepts that are certainly not reducible to these dualist intuitive appeals to authentic inner life versus a dehumanized world of externality. This may have been true in some texts. It's certainly not true of Karen Barad, whose work is perhaps the major instance of feminist science studies embracing a naturalistic perspective. She seeks to connect science studies to a feminist ontology in which, as she says, subject and object are intra-actively constituted within practices. Her name for her theory is agential realism, and it holds here a slide. Barad's agential realism holds that we are metaphysically and ethically accountable to the material. But this accountability is not just about some external independent reality. It's about, to simplify, you might say about action. And for those of you familiar with or interested in early 20th century thought, I think that someone who was writing very much in this direction and who is both out of fashion and sometimes comes back for a little bit into fashion is John Dewey. So John Dewey's work, in its attempt to connect a naturalism, a theory of political and social action, and in some sense a metaphysics, is actually quite comparable here. Anyway, that's a parenthesis. Barad's position is a form of new materialism because she emphasizes that materiality is agential reality. Next slide. Yeah. I'm getting to that. Sorry. I meant to stay on the same slide, so go back one. Yeah, so moving downwards from the first paragraph. Sorry. Thank you, Carolina. Barad maintains, that the body's materiality, for example, its anatomy and physiology, actively matter to processes of materialization. And the more we understand that, I think she means, the more we connect agency and power. And the more cosmic version of this, so the more, for those of you who were Kantians or studied Kant, here we are precisely hitting the danger of rational metaphysics. We're hitting the danger implicit in things like object-oriented ontology. And a very recent issue of the journal October is devoted to a so-called questionnaire on materialisms, mostly people in the art theory world, but not only. And many of them, it was striking to me when I read it, preparing for this paper, this talk. I don't know, let's say 3/4 of the 20 authors who replied to this questionnaire attacked object-oriented ontology and its related forms for a sort of naive immanence, naive appeal to ontology, flatness, etc. I don't have a lot to say about that problem. I'm simply mentioning it here. And so what I'm calling cosmic is precisely people instantly ontologizing everything. So we're in a sort of giant one world where everything is real. A difference that I think does endure between between the early modern forms of embodied materialism and new materialist talk of materiality, is that the latter is primarily defined in terms of and oriented towards issues of agency, of self-construction, and historicity, notably with regards to gender. So now, next slide. Thank you. In one prominent statement of the field, Frost, a scholarly and theoretical focus on the body's materiality is nothing new. Feminists have been denaturalizing embodiment in material objects, etc., etc. So that's a very, I think, precise statement of what sort of materiality, what sort of body, what sort of agency is at issue. And Barad says something similar. She says, for new materialists, quote, matter is always already an ongoing historicity. And in a recent interview, in a fairly recent interview, in the Dolfijn and Van der Tuin volume, she says materiality itself is always already a desiring dynamism, a reiterative reconfiguring, energized and energizing, etc. So the materiality that's at issue here has very little to do with the biological or medical analyses which early modern materialists were appealing to, including speculatively appealing to in sort of imaginary science. It also has very little to do with their reductionist, deflationary impetus, what Adorno called in a lovely phrase, materialism's demaskinierende Tendenz. It's unmasking tendency. So materialism in the old form had as one of its basic job descriptions to destroy, to unmask, to reduce, to disturb, to destabilize. And there's no sense of either the explanatory power of reductionist explanations or of kind of Lemaitrian metaphysical courage in new materialist ontophonies of materiality, vitality, relationality, self-creativity, productivity, unpredictability. And I have in mind Jane Bennett's Enchanted Materialism, which famously ascribes agency to inorganic phenomena such as the electricity grid, food, and trash. Again, back to the absolute ontology point, and in this case with what I was calling earlier a bit loosely neo-pagan, so animistic. Theories of materiality, including now new materialism, even though the latter does emphasize its engagement with biology, these theories of materiality challenge the essentialism of traditional materialism. Sometimes it's scientism, sometimes with a somewhat outdated vision of Descartes, Newton, and old materialists as ideologists of mastery of nature. The embodied materialism I've described here, I've briefly described, is neither an essentialism nor a scientism, especially not in Diderot. Nor does it privilege the subjective. Slide. And I don't know why I felt the need to put pictures late in the presentation, but there they are. The materialist trend in philosophy recognizes the existence of objective external reality, as well as its independence in relation to the knowing and perceiving subject. So this is an elegant statement of the, how could I say, the materialist position according to which the world is prior to the thinker, right? So the forms of materialism that I've been discussing, that I'm interested in, are neither seeking to restore some sort of post-Husserlian subjectivity, thinking of enactivism, nor are they caught in this kind of, Tron-like grid of a pure mechanistic world. They're literally not in that world. And so then the question is, how could I say, what difference between the old and the new, and what can we learn from this reconsideration of the old? I also, this I've said before, but there's one more illustrative slide, so slide. Materialism is not just anti-foundational, anti-essentialist, but when I said that the new materialism doesn't seem to include the particularly destabilizing character of some of the early modern materialism, here's an illustration of what I mean by that destabilization. And this, I'm happy discussion on it. The Lemaitrian episode in this context takes us on a different route if we follow the history, so to speak. It takes us on a route through the Marquis de Sade to a kind of extreme deterministic hedonism, which some people can find radical and charming, other people can find immoral and dangerous. That takes us on a sort of other historico-conceptual avenue, which is different both from the one exploring today and from a more, how could I say, if you open histories of cognitive science and philosophy of mind, you will find Lemaitre playing a role there too, but it's yet another role. So, final slide to conclude. Hanging questions. Let me try to say this. So one thing that I've tried to emphasize is that new materialism ends up with, I don't know if you have the expression strange bedfellows, but it ends up with Engels as this funny companion. And it's a position you find differently, but again in Delson and Sartre very explicitly in his famous article, Materialism and Revolution. And so I hope that it's clear that there was such a thing as a vital materialism and embodied materialism, but of course the question remains open. Should it lead us to rethink new materialism? How? One problem that I mentioned, and it's a sort of, it's not really in my talk, it's an unfolding issue after my talk, is this question of ontology and the relation to biology. And one question would be, well, what biology? When new materialism seeks to have a more friendly relation to biology, we can ask, which biology would be? And I think that's, I put that quotation from Frost because I find it very interesting. I'm not completely sure what to say about it. I leave it there whether for her or someone else to comment on, because it's very clear that there's an engagement with the biology, and then the question is what happens with that engagement. So I'm simply, it's like a post-it, I'm noting that there. And the last 2 points are really the same. That's one point. It's what do we do in this turn to ontology? What exactly is it getting at us? One of the few things that I can clearly understand that the ontologization, the cosmic turn, the immanence, etc., is doing, one of the few things that I understand as its effects, or as if it's, I don't know, useful effects, is from the point of view of ecology. It seems rather self-evident why that would be useful from an ecological perspective. And for the perfect confirmation of that is a negative confirmation. It's that extremely vulgar pamphlet against ecology written by my half-compatriot Luc Ferry in the 80s, I think, called Le Nouvel Ordre Écologique, the New Ecological Order. It was a perfect polemic against ecology, Heidegger, Joseph Beuys, etc., as dangerous, in a sense, immanentization of nature and humanity, whereas we know that leads, for someone like Luc Ferry, we know that it leads to terrible things in the 20th century, and what we need is human rights, and in that sense, humanism. So the ecological power of the ontologization is obvious to me, but how could I put this? And this is my last comments. If I put it in a sort of private bandyish way, like as if I am alone in my cabinet, turning from one book to another and opening them, so to speak. You can see that my background is not that of a lovely cabinet. If I turn from Lametrian unmasking to Bennett's ontophony, to Bennett's rejoicing in totality, something peculiar has happened along the way, and that's what I have to say for today. So thank you.
Thank you so much for a very interesting conference. Now we would like to see if the audience has some questions for you. Ahora abrimos el espacio para que ustedes, si tienen algunas preguntas, que le hagamos al Dr. Wolfe. Nosotros podemos traducirles si no manejan el inglés.
And French is okay for me too.
Thank you so much. También pueden ser en francés porque el conferencista maneja el francés. We have a question there for you.
Yes, I have a question for you. What about the soul? Suppose you are a Christian. What place does it have in this materialistic conception of man? That's it.
Oh, thank you. It's okay, you can hear me if I answer?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
So that's a question which goes straight into my work, my interests, things that I have been reading and writing a lot about for about 5 or 10 years, which means I have a hard time answering easily. I wrote a paper a few years ago with a former student of mine called The Material Soul, and I was borrowing that title, that phrase. I was borrowing the title from an anonymous clandestine manuscript from the 1730s called in French L'âme matérielle, so the material soul. And what I wanted to reconstruct in that paper, which was very historical, was the existence of an Epicurean Lucretian tradition where it's materialism, but the soul is not just erased or denied in favor of solid things and laws of physics and laws of mechanics. The soul is somehow still there, but it's a material soul. So that's a strategy, that's a tradition that I was very interested in. Of course, that doesn't fully answer the question, because the Christian soul is not necessarily, let me rephrase it, the Christian, but the question then is which kind of Christian too. The Christian will not recognize the soul that they like in the Epicurean material soul. My second historical point of answering, or example in answering, is a very interesting and very unknown or not well known micro-tradition that was really in England, beginning in the early 1700s and then taken up by Joseph Priestley in the 1770s, 80s. It was a Christian tradition, but it was heretical, and it was a form of mortalism. So the name for the heresy is mortalism. And the mortalist heresy is that the soul dies with the body, but is resurrected on the day of last judgment. So you had a few writers, usually doctors, in the early 1700s, who would insist that you could be a materialist and somehow keep a minimal Christianity. And, we might find that either contradictory or strange, but it's a historical fact. And Priestley, as I said, in the later years of the 18th century, Priestley put a lot of work, a lot of conceptual work into trying to defend the possibility of a Christian materialism. And he thought things like Cartesian substance dualism are, how can I put it? He has a beautiful argument where he says something like, show me in the Holy Scriptures where there is substance dualism. So it's that attitude that says, I will only take as authentic what is in the Scriptures. So what people like Descartes are telling me is metaphysically also true, I don't have to respect. So Priestley has an interesting strategy there. So those are my two answers. You can have a material soul if you wish.
Thank you.
Buen día. Quería que te profundices o explayes sobre los conflictos o los problemas relacionados o referidos a la inmanencia.
Yeah, he would like you to go deeper into the conflicts related to immanence.
Well, so you're forcing me to think live, because it's a topic that I have been noting its presence for the last year or two that I've started reading these materials, and I don't have a worked out body of work on it. But what I said 2 minutes before about compare the intellectual and compare the ethos of La Métrie to the ethos of Jane Bennett. And it's not that immanence or immanentism is only in the second case, because all of these semi or proto-Spinozists in the 18th century are in some sense immanentists as well. They are anti-hierarchical, they are monists, of course. But then the question is, what does it mean to find yourself in a kind of flat ontology? And in that sense, I think the, what should I call them? The old materialist can do some more disturbing things in that immanent ontology than this kind of cosmic unity vision. In the 18th century, if you invoked something like cosmic unity, it could be very dangerous, like the chain of being. It could be a way of saying, for example, between the monkey and me, there are only very minor differences. And La Métrie suggests those differences can be fixed by a medical operation on the larynx. And in that sense, it's an immanentism with extremely aggressive socio-political intentions and consequences. Whereas the immanence that you get in L'immanence une vie by Deleuze, as far as I know, the last thing he wrote, or some of these other more enthusiastic versions, is, in the case of L'immanence une vie, is a bit melancholy. So it's not the text that I find the most colorful in his work. And in the case of the more enthusiastic versions, again, I can't get into I'm not equipped to get into a debate on the Latour version of object-oriented ontology. But as much as there's something brilliant and brilliantly cynical at times in Latour, and I teach him, and there are things I've learned a lot from him, this aspect, I forget what he calls it, but this sort of everything is real ontology, I'm not sure what we do with it. I'm not sure what it helps us do. So it's not maybe not a very interesting answer, but that's my answer for now. It depends on what you do with your immanence, I guess.
Thank you. ¿Alguna otra pregunta? Yes, please. Samantha Frost is going to ask you a question because she's among the people in the audience.
Yeah, I pretended not to know that in my talk.
Hi there.
Hey.
So I'm interested in the way that you're constructing the old versus the new, because it sounds like you're suggesting that the new materialisms, whatever they are sort of constructing their philosophies out of whole cloth, like as if they're just pulling it out of their heads. But my understanding is that a lot of the people who work on the new materialisms have borrowed from Epicurus, from Herodotus, from Lucretius. My own work began with Hobbes, and so I'm just interested so it seems like for some of the new materialism scholars that I know, it provides an opportunity to go back and revisit older philosophers. And so I'm interested in what your temporalization accomplishes, or what it's trying to get us to think about critically, given that many of these scholars do indeed go back from and borrow from some of the older philosophies.
Yeah, thank you. So I didn't mean to suggest that new materialism
Hang on,
is...
hang on just
Yeah?
a second. I think someone is going to translate the question just a little bit.
Okay.
No? No?
No, lo que está preguntando Samantha es qué función cumple la conceptualización, la oposición entre viejo y nuevo materialismo, cuando los nuevos materialismos vuelven a leer a antiguos autores que sí trabajaron con materialismo. O sea, lo que le está preguntando básicamente es qué función cumple hacer esa oposición, dónde empieza esa cronología.
Yeah. No, so I didn't mean to say that new materialism is this sort of young child on a 2,000-year stage where suddenly there's a 5-year-old full of enthusiasm making up things versus the history. I'm aware that quotations from and engagements with historical texts are right there. My problem, well, I guess there's different micro-genres or different genres at work within the big tent, new materialism. If I think of some of your work contrasting with Barad on the one hand and Bennett on the other hand, I think we would already see right there, and I'm just speaking spontaneously, 3 rather different engagements with the past in which perhaps in Barad there's the least of all, since it's something like a theoretical structure where there's physics and some form of feminism, and then, theoretical activity within these. Anyway, so I'm aware that there's plenty of work engaging with, and in the case of Bennett, somewhat breathlessly putting names in a paragraph. Sometimes, you can get from Epicurus to Bergson to Whitehead to Deleuze to, I don't know, Lacan or someone in the same line. So I was wrestling with, in the beginning of my talk, I was wrestling with something like this problem, because I was saying there's a sort of boring reaction, which is to say, but look, those of us who work full-time on historical figure X, Y, or Z will disagree with the new materialists as to the internal contents of the theory, the thought, the system of historical actor X, Y, or Z. I've read a few papers doing that. There's a volume in progress now that comes out of a project on materialism and new materialism at Rice University in Houston. And I'm part of that volume, and I've read some of the other things in the volume, and some papers do exactly that. I was indeed trying to say, let's look at what happens to the old versus new polarization in the new materialism when we reflect on the so-called old. So the fact that Epicurus is invoked, well, let's say we all agree Epicurus is great and we will all be invoking him. Then the question is, invoking him to do what? And I just reviewed a volume called Lucretius and the Early Modern. I think that's what it's called. And I think it's in the introduction, one of the editors does a very nice job saying, look, some people like Michel Serres and I guess Deleuze make Lucretius into the Klineman thinker, and they're obsessed with randomness and against substantiality and foundations. Others make other usages of him. And I was trying to evaluate some of the new materialist claims, including its historiography, in light of supposedly working on some of those old options. Hence, my resurrection of the by now dead, or at least old-fashioned category of mechanistic materialism, which I'm too young to have known the period when that was an obsessive term. But if you read texts from the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, probably, in either very Marxist literature, well, very, you might say Marxist-Leninist literature, or some other literature, you get a very active usage of this concept. And I was suggesting that part of the new versus old polarity in new materialism is perpetuating something like that. Because otherwise, why would it be new? And I'm sorry if this sounds like a Talmudist or a lawyer or something. However, I wanted to be on the record as saying that it's not a theoretical project as such that I'm trying to say, oh, I can historically delegitimize the theoretical project. Of course not. I wouldn't want to, and it would be silly, and it would fail. So that if Donna Haraway comes along and says, well, I'm writing an article about the category of cyborg, and I have some references to the contemporary world and to some episodes in theory and history that allow me to articulate my theory, my model, right, whatever, then there's no historical problem whatsoever. One takes it, one might, I don't know, have a political disagreement, which I don't have. Whereas new materialism, since, as you say, since it has this relation to the past, at least some of the time, then it's fair to want to talk about exactly what that past is, how it works, how it's being used, how it's being reconstructed, and so forth. So I think that's my answer, and I'm sorry, not to be there to have a more civilized interaction on the topic, because it's certainly something I care about.
Thank you. ¿Alguna otra pregunta? Okay, thank you so much for your generosity to share with us what you know and to participate in the colloquiums online. Thank you so much again.
Thank you for your invitation.